I have read the same comment in one form or another. Probably 1,000 times over the years this channel has existed, and it comes from everyone, from someone who installed their first distro yesterday to someone who's been running Arch for a decade. And it always says some version of the same painful thing. I wish someone had told me this before I started. And after hearing that enough times, I stopped treating it as a coincidence and started treating it as a mandate. So today, I'm finally sitting down and building the definitive version of this list, combining everything I've personally learned from over a decade of daily driving Linux with the sharpest, hardest won advice pulled straight from thousands of comments and from the wider Linux community itself. 10 things. Almost every single one of us wishes we'd known before we made the switch. If you installed your first distro last week, or you're still sitting on the fence right now trying to decide whether to actually do it, stop scrolling, because this is the video that saves you months of avoidable pain. Let's start with the mistake nearly everyone makes in their very first hour. You go down a YouTube rabbit hole, you find someone running some gorgeous, obscure tiling window manager setup with a custom color scheme and 100 keyboard shortcuts, and you think that's where I should start. Don't. That system took years to build, and it will break your motivation in a single afternoon. In 2026, the data across every major comparison site and community poll says the same thing again and again. Linux Mint and Ubuntu remain the two smartest starting points that exist, and for very specific reasons. Mint feels almost eerily familiar if you're coming from Windows, with a taskbar and start menu layout that doesn't force you to relearn basic navigation on day one, while your muscle memory is still fighting you on everything else. Ubuntu, meanwhile, has the largest community and the deepest software library of any desktop distro on Earth, and that matters enormously the night you inevitably hit a wall at 11 p.m. and need to Google your way out of it, because someone, somewhere, has already solved your exact problem and written it down. Both install in well under 30 minutes on modern hardware. Both come with years of guaranteed security updates baked in, so you're not gambling with your stability while you're still learning where anything is. But here's where my actual advice goes one step further than the obvious pick a mainstream distro rule everyone repeats. Don't just pick a mainstream distro. Pick one and then stay on it long enough to actually learn it, because the second lesson on this list only works if the first one sticks. Seriously consider running a VPN, and I want to have an honest conversation about this one instead of just dropping it in as a checklist item. If part of the reason you're leaving Windows or macOS is genuine discomfort with how much telemetry and background data collection those platforms quietly bake into your everyday experience, that exact same instinct needs to follow you onto Linux, not disappear the moment you switch. Changing your operating system changes who controls your local machine. It does absolutely nothing to change what your internet provider or every website you visit can still see about your traffic. A solid VPN encrypts that connection and masks your real location, and the value here goes well past abstract privacy paranoia. It's the difference between your data being exposed on public Wi-Fi or protected, and it's what stands between you and content libraries locked to a country you're not currently sitting in. The Linux support situation for VPNs has genuinely matured, so look for a provider that's actually been independently audited, because that distinction matters infinitely more than flashy marketing about server counts in 40 countries. And now we hit the piece of advice that comes up more than any other singles thing in this community, the one I cannot overstate enough because it's the mistake that eventually trips up almost everyone, no matter how experienced they think they are. Backup, backup, backup. This isn't a suggestion. It's closer to folk wisdom passed down through the entire ecosystem at this point. And there are really two completely separate things you need in place. First, system-level backups, which capture the actual state of your operating system and configuration, so you can roll everything back the second an update breaks something. Or you make a change you immediately regret. Timeshift is genuinely the easiest entry point here, available on most major distros directly through your software manager, letting you create restore points manually before doing anything risky, or automatically on a schedule, so your entire system can snap back to a known good state in a few clicks if something goes catastrophically wrong. If your distro runs on the Btrfs file system, you've also got native snapshotting available through tools, like Snapper, working at the file system level and often executing large rollbacks even faster. Second, and just as critical, your actual personal data, documents, photos, project files, the things you genuinely cannot replace. This is where cloud storage earns its keep completely. But if you'd rather keep everything local, Ubuntu's built-in backup tool, or Déjà Dup on other distros through your software center, handles straightforward personal file backups without demanding any deep technical knowledge from you at all. Here's the honest truth nobody wants to hear on day one. Something is going to go wrong on your system eventually. Maybe it's your own mistake. Maybe it's a genuinely unlucky update, and having a real backup routine already in place is the entire difference between that moment being a minor, forgettable inconvenience or a genuinely terrible day that makes you question the whole switch. Next, get intentional about where your software is actually coming from, because one of the things that quietly ambushes new Linux users is discovering just how many different ways there are to install a single application. If you're not deliberate about it, you end up with a genuinely messy system pulling packages from a dozen inconsistent and unvetted sources. And that's exactly how security problems start. My recommendation, and this lines up with what the broader Linux security community consistently advises, is to treat it like a priority ladder. Start with your distro's official repositories first, because those packages are vetted and maintained specifically for your system. From there, move to Flatpak, which has matured enormously over the last few years, specifically because it isolates applications from your core system, meaning a problematic app is far less likely to cause system-wide chaos. FlatHub in particular has become a genuinely massive, well-maintained catalog, and it's usually your best bet for newer or less mainstream software that hasn't made it into your distro's default repos yet. Only after exhausting those two options should you start looking at third-party PPAs or external repositories, and random standalone binaries or scripts downloaded straight off some website should be your absolute last resort, reserved for the rare situation where genuinely nothing else works. This isn't about gatekeeping how you use your own machine. It's purely about security. Software from vetted, maintained sources gets timely patches and doesn't carry the same risk of you unknowingly installing something malicious. Now, learn the terminal, even though you probably don't have to. Graphical software managers, settings panels, and update tools have gotten dramatically better across every major distro, and plenty of people genuinely run Linux for years without ever opening a terminal window. But you should still learn it anyway, because it makes you dramatically more capable the moment something actually breaks. And nearly every troubleshooting guide across the entire Linux community is written assuming at least basic terminal familiarity. Start small. Learn your specific distro's package management commands first. apt if you're on Debian-based systems like Mint or Ubuntu, DNF if you land on Fedora, or pacman if you eventually find yourself on an Arch-based system. These commands follow a genuinely logical structure once you push past the initial unfamiliarity, and they become a natural gateway into understanding how the command line works more broadly. One habit worth building from day one: never blindly copy and paste commands you find in random forum posts or comment sections without understanding what they actually do first. Type them out yourself. Take the extra 60 seconds to look up what each flag and argument is actually doing, because that single habit alone will save you from accidentally running something destructive on your own system, and you'll genuinely retain far more of what you're learning in the process. Here's a harder lesson to internalize, because it fights directly against your own curiosity. Stop distro hopping constantly, because there's always something newer and shinier glowing on the horizon. And look, I understand the pull completely. The Linux ecosystem in 2026 has more genuinely excellent options than it's ever had. And between Ubuntu, Mint, Fedora, Zorin, Elementary OS, and dozens of smaller projects, there's a constant stream of new releases and new desktop environments being covered across YouTube and Reddit that make it tempting to wipe out a perfectly good, working system just to try something else. But every single time you do that, you're resetting your own progress, reconfiguring the same settings, reinstalling the same applications, relearning the exact muscle memory you already built the last time. My actual recommendation ties directly back to keeping a separate home partition. Treat your main system the way you'd treat a reliable daily driver car, not a science experiment. If the itch to try something new hits you, and it will, spin up a second partition specifically reserved for experimentation. Or better yet, launch a virtual machine using something like VirtualBox, where you can break absolutely anything you want without any risk to the system you actually depend on every day. Now, brace yourself for the most common frustration new switchers run into that nobody warns them about clearly enough. Document formatting, looking subtly, maddeningly wrong. It isn't a bug, it's a font. Substitution problem, because the core Microsoft fonts, Calibri, Cambria, Times New Roman, Arial, simply aren't included by default on most Linux distributions, for licensing reasons that have nothing to do with technical limitations. The fix has two parts. First, install the Microsoft Core Fonts package, usually available through your distros. Repositories under a name like TTF-MS Scorefonts installer, which handles the classic fonts directly. Second, for the newer fonts not covered by that package, several Linux-focused projects have been actively building metric-compatible replacements, fonts specifically engineered to match the exact character spacing and dimensions of their Microsoft counterparts, even though they aren't literally the same font file underneath. Once you've got both the core fonts package and the metric-compatible replacements installed, your document compatibility with anything coming out of Microsoft Office improves dramatically. And that persistent low-grade, why does my formatting always look slightly off feeling? Key piece of advice that ties every single other item on this list together. Manage your expectations and actually enjoy the process rather than white-knuckling your way through it. This is genuinely the most important mindset shift for anyone attempting this switch in 2026. Don't expect every piece of software or every piece of hardware to work flawlessly the moment you boot up, because that's not a realistic standard for any operating system on the planet, Linux included, even with how dramatically hardware support has improved in recent years. Wi-Fi cards, specific printer models, certain proprietary peripherals, they'll occasionally need some extra configuration, and that's simply part of the territory, not a sign you've made a mistake. The advice that consistently comes up from experienced users across this entire community is deceptively simple but genuinely important. Don't quit the moment something doesn't. Work perfectly in your first 5 minutes. Be patient. Search for your specific issue, because the odds are overwhelming that someone else has already run into and solved the exact problem sitting in front of you right now. And the Linux community's documentation and forum culture remains one of its genuine, enduring strengths even today. And beyond simply pushing through the friction, actually enjoy learning the system, because one of the things that makes Linux fundamentally different from the operating systems most of us grew up on is the sheer degree of control you actually have over how your own machine behaves. You're not living inside someone else's predetermined vision of how your desktop should look and function. You have almost total agency to shape it into exactly what works for you, and that's a genuinely rare thing in modern computing. Worth appreciating rather than treating as some technical inconvenience you're forced to push through on your way to somewhere else. So that's the full list. 10 things that collectively represent years of trial and error, hard-earned community wisdom, and honestly, a fair number of mistakes I made myself early on that I'm hoping this saves you from repeating firsthand. If you're sitting there right now trying to decide whether this is actually the right moment to make the jump, here's my honest read. Heading into the back half of 2026, the distros have never been more polished. Hardware support has never been broader, and the community resources waiting for you the moment you get stuck have never been more extensive. There genuinely isn't a better window to try this than the one you're standing in right now. I want to step back for a second and connect all 10 of these points, because individually they're useful, standalone tips, but together they point at something much bigger about how you should be thinking about this entire transition. The partition setup, the backups, the software sourcing habits, the terminal literacy, every single one of them is really pointing at the same underlying philosophy, which is that Linux rewards intentionality in a way Windows and macOS were never built to. Those platforms are largely designed to make decisions for you quietly in the background, and that can feel convenient right up until the exact moment you want to understand or change something and realize you were never given the access to do so in the first place. Linux flips that relationship entirely. It hands the decisions directly to you, which is genuinely empowering, but it also means the burden of setting things up thoughtfully from the very beginning falls squarely on your shoulders. That's exactly why these 10 things matter as much as they do. They're the actual difference between months of avoidable, frustrating friction and a system that just quietly works the way you intend it to, starting from week 1. I also want to be honest about something that doesn't get said enough in videos like this one, which is that you are not going to get everything right on your first attempt, and that is completely fine. I've been doing this for 12 years now, and I still occasionally hit something that makes me go back and second guess a setup decision I made years ago without a second thought. The point of this list was never to make you feel like you have to perfectly execute all 10 of these on day 1 before you're allowed to call yourself a real Linux user. It's meant to be a reference point, something you can come back to as you're settling in, so that the moment you do hit a rough patch, an update that breaks something, a document that refuses to format correctly, or the sudden itch to distro hop into something shinier, you've already got the framework in place to handle it without losing your personal data or your patience in the process. If I had to boil this entire list down into the single highest leverage piece of advice for anyone genuinely new to this, it would be this. Get your backups and your partition set up right before anything else, because everything downstream becomes dramatically lower stakes once those two foundations are actually in place. Install a sketchy third-party package that causes chaos? No big deal. You've got a Timeshift, snapshot to roll straight back to. Even a full reinstall becomes a non-event when your personal files are sitting safely on their own partition or backed up somewhere else entirely, which is exactly why those two habits are positioned early in this list rather than tacked on as an afterthought at the end. It's also worth acknowledging just how far this entire ecosystem has come, specifically in the last year or two. because it genuinely changes how relevant some of this advice is compared to when I first started this channel over a decade ago. Flatpak and FlatHub have matured into a genuinely reliable software distribution model that simply didn't exist in its current form when a lot of us were first getting started, which makes the software sourcing advice from earlier dramatically easier to actually follow in practice today. VPN clients on Linux have gone from a command line configuration headache reserved for the technically fearless to polished native applications with proper graphical interfaces across most major providers. And distros like Mint and Zorin have specifically invested in font compatibility and interface familiarity in ways that directly target the exact friction points that used to push new switchers straight back to Windows within their very first month. None of that means the learning curve has vanished entirely. It hasn't. But it is measurably, meaningfully gentler than it used to be, and that's genuinely worth knowing if you've been sitting on the fence, waiting for the right moment. So if you're still there right now, still running Windows or macOS, still just watching videos like this one out of curiosity rather than commitment, I want to actually hear from you. What's holding you back from making the jump? Is it one specific piece of software you're worried won't have a Linux equivalent, a particular hardware concern, or just general uncertainty about where to even begin? Tell me in the comments, because there's a genuinely good chance either myself or someone else in this community has already solved exactly the problem sitting between you and switching. And if this video helped clear even a little of the fog around getting started, or gave you a few concrete things to fix on a system you're already running, that's exactly what this channel exists for. And I'll keep spending the next however many years helping people navigate this exact transition, from complete beginners installing their first distro to people years into their journey, still quietly picking up new habits along the way. Drop a like if you're already running Linux day to day, and let me know in the comments how long you've been using it and which distro you finally landed on.